This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Welcome to the Starlight Ballroom. Hey!
Hello, and you're listening to Shipwrecked Comatose, the Red Dwarf podcast hosted on the We Made This Podcast network. I am not your host, Kurt North, and neither am I the host, Mark Adams. No, this is Matt Latham. This is the good-looking one out the lot. And they've finally given me the keys to Starbug. I am now driving the ship. And naturally, like in most Red Dwarf episodes, it crashes. So, so this is slightly different from your usual things. And I think if you're looking at this on your on the website, on your podcast app of choice, you would have noticed the name, the Brittas Empire. And that's what we're going to be talking about in this special. We're going to be talking about the first series of the Brittas Empire with the aim of covering each series with their own special as we gradually go through the series. And I'm not going to be talking about this alone. I'm going to be joined by my apparently good friend, Tony Black, the host of a million podcasts, nearly as many as Mark, and pretty much the commander-in-chief, or the managing director, the Gordon Brittas himself of the We Made This Podcast network, Mr. Tony Black. How are you doing, Tony?
Hello, Matthew. That's the first of my terrible Chris Barrie as Brittas impressions. But no, cheers. It's a pleasure to be here on Pick a Disc. Shipwrecked Comatose. It's great. Thank you for inviting me.
No, it's fine. It's not going to be the first time we accidentally reference my other podcast on this, I think. So
I did it before you could.
Yes, thank you. Yes, you got that out of the way. But yes, so Tony's here because one of the reasons I wanted to have Tony as the guest of choice for these was that Tony is quite a strong fan of the British sitcom, and I don't know if it's announced. I don't know if we've actually fully announced it yet, but We Made This is also working on a British sitcom led podcast. Why don't you quickly speak about that for a second?
Well, this is actually quite possibly a Shipwrecked and Comatose exclusive, because anyone who does listen to any We Made These shows, or I'm guessing if you like Shipwrecked and Comatose, you like comedies, you like British comedies, so you might be interested in You Have Been Watching, which I am co-hosting with a great guy who has actually a bit of a connection to Red Dwarf, which we may well find out more about on this podcast in time, called Rob Turnbull. And we are looking at British sitcoms in quite some level of depth, a combination of different focuses on specific shows, such as Fawlty Towers or The Office, the UK one, and then deep dives into particular topics. So things like weird 90s sitcoms from on Channel 4 and things like that, or the writing career of people like Roy Clark, who did things like Last of the Summer Wine and Keeping Up Appearances. So we're going to cover quite a bit of a spectrum, and we've recorded a couple of episodes, and it's great fun, I have to say. Well, that's really presumptuous of me. We think it was great fun. We've certainly enjoyed recording it. Whether you think it's fun to listen to, we'll see. But we will announce it properly soon. Until we don't quite know when it's going to air, but we're hopeful it will be at some point this summer, and then we'll trickle episodes out. So definitely keep your eye out for it. It's called You Have Been Watching, and you'll be able to find it on the We Made This Podcast network very soon. Yeah,
I'm so looking forward to that. I can't wait to see what happens with that, because it's an idea that's been bandied around for ages. And again, I think if you I'm assuming if you've listened to this and you haven't turned it off already, because I'm neither Kurt or Mark, and you're still listening to this, then you'll definitely like You Have Been Watching, because I'm not on that one yet. We're going to go and head towards and speak about Brittas Empire in this conversation, and what this episode is going to be. It's going to be a conversation between myself and Tony. It's going to be a bit of a conference where we just go and share some ideas and some thoughts and feelings about what we have seen and watched in this like 6 little half-hour episodes that comprise the first season of this series. And we're just going to get some kind of like consensus and like shared opinion, and maybe just duke it out a bit in terms of talking. And we'll just have feeling all kind of nice. Isn't that right, Tony?
That's actually really you've nailed it there with it. Isn't that right? That's because it's a little bit Kenneth Williams, and it quite a lot more particular Chris Barrie in this style. That's very good, and that's exactly what we're going to do.
Yes,
yeah. I think because there's loads. As with one of the reasons I'm doing that other podcast is that there's so many things going on with sitcoms, and this is a good example of that, for sure.
Yeah, and if anyone's listening to this for the first time and have no idea what we're talking about, The Brittas Empire is, in fact, a British sitcom. It was created by Andrew Norris and Richard Fagan, and Chris Barrie, who you might know as a character called Rimmer on a TV show called Red Dwarf, was the titular character, Gordon Brittas, the well-intended but hugely incompetent manager of the fictional Whitbury Leisure Centre. The show ran for 7 series, so you're going to have 6 more of these, and there's 2 Christmas specials. There's 2 Christmas specials, and it ran from 1991 to 1997 on BBC One. Norris and Fagan carried out the first 5 series, and the series at one point peaked at 10 million viewers, and it enjoys a long and it's a long and successful run, and I think at the peak of its popularity probably reached the higher popularity than Red Dwarf in terms of like how many people are watching it. But with Red Dwarf, I think there's been a lot more of a cult fan base, and there probably wasn't 10 people watching it at the same time. But it's one of these shows that Red Dwarf has probably lasted the test of time because of just how much it connects with people. Whereas at the time, The Brittas Empire was probably one of the biggest sitcoms on the BBC. It's at one point it was hailed as the Fawlty Towers of the 90s. It was fast paced, and it was noted on the best of the Britcoms, which I think is an article somewhere. It was fast paced, outrageous comedy full of invented gags, and it was massive. To put it into perspective, you would never see the cast of Red Dwarf do a 3-minute sketch at the Royal Variety Performance. One of the specials on the DVD box set is a clip of bit later on because there's a character that gets introduced later on that appears in it, but they pretty much do a live 3-minute sketch as all the characters of the Brittas Empire at the Royal Variety Performance. I doubt you'd see the Red Dwarf characters doing that, and the character of Gordon Brittas has appeared. Chris Barrie used to appear in character on the Noel's House Party, knocking on the door, and there's compilations. There's quite a few of them actually, compilations where you see Chris Barrie turn up in character on the Noel's House Party. And for international listeners who don't know what Noel's House Party is, it's very long and complex, but it was a massive Saturday night show which was like massive with loads of it was one of the big primetime shows of the 90s. And again, you wouldn't see the Red Dwarf characters show up on that either. So that's so in terms of impact. But I don't think that the Brittas Empire has a legacy that's lasted as long or a fan base as strong as Red Dwarf, which Red Dwarf just has that cult kind of like passionate fan base, and I think Brittas Empire has its fans as well, but it hasn't lasted the test of time. And you can't really, you probably wouldn't be able to see Brittas Empire come back as Red Dwarf could do. It's
funny you should say that though, because there has been some talk of it that Chris Barrie last year was saying that he thought there was mileage in coming back and doing more, and apparently the writers are developing a new script. These things are always you hear this a lot though with sitcoms, and very rarely, especially with the gap of time with something like this, do they ever really come of it. So I wouldn't hold your breath, but I think you're right in that it's understandable why Red Dwarf comes back, because Red Dwarf actually entered popular culture. It actually made a dent. Even though it was a cult show, it became a cult show in the vein of things in the 80s, a bit like The Young Ones and those kind of things, where people still remembered them. And obviously, Red Dwarf carried on, unlike that show. Red Dwarf has had a long shelf life. You know, it's probably going to be in the running for one of the longest running sitcoms ever in British history, probably, if it carries on, because over the span of it, it's been over 3 decades, even if it hasn't been every year. So Brittas doesn't have that. It was one of those things that I think never really broke out into that kind of cultural footprint as Red Dwarf did, even though during the 90s it was very popular. It was very much one of those sitcoms that the whole family would laugh at. You know, it's the sort of thing my mum would have laughed at. My mum wouldn't. My mum wouldn't have got Red Dwarf. You know, and you know this, and some of the other people who make the show know this. I'm a bit of a heretic because I haven't actually watched much Red Dwarf at all. It's not that I don't like it. I've just never done it. So God knows what I'm doing on this podcast. You're a madman for inviting me. But
you're doing the short straw. Everyone else said no.
Yes, probably.
Yeah. It's like, oh God,
yeah, last resort. But I am looking forward to Red Dwarf, and I definitely admire the reach that show's had, and it is. There is a reason that something like Red Dwarf has lasted, and Brittas was popular, but it hasn't had that reach. And I think that's because there is probably a limit in many ways to where Brittas went in terms of what it did. You know, and it is of its time. You know, it is massively of its time.
Yeah, really. and I mean there are. We'll get into a bit of the minutiae of things a bit later on, because there are interesting things about the show that we can talk about, which we'll bring up a bit later on. But again, just to give a bit more background for people listening again, what I don't want to do is, because we're planning on doing these individually, I don't want to talk about future series, because I do have vague recollections of stuff that happens. There's at least a couple of episodes of the things that have never left my mind because of how big they are, and I'm not gonna, and they're quite spoilers if people aren't watching, but there's crazy things that happen. This actually at some points the Brittas Empire goes beyond the realms of believability that even Red Dwarf does, but yeah, and that's a science fiction show. But so to give a bit more background on this, Gordon Brittas is well-meaning, but he's a bit of an incompetent manager of Whitbury Leisure Centre. At the start of the series, he's just been assigned, and as we find out, he's married, and his wife Helen she's on the verge of a nervous breakdown pretty much all the time because of being married to him. But and like the very unsubtle suggestion is that she's very unhappy and pretty much constantly has affairs and all that kind of stuff. He's often Brittas has two deputy managers. One, Laura, who is deputy manager dry, which I think is like, from what I gather, it just means that she's in charge of all the dry stuff, like all the tennis courts and the badminton squash courts and all the gym stuff. And you got Colin, who's deputy manager wet, which I'm assuming just means that he's just like in charge of the pool. And then there are several different employees. Then you have Tim and Gavin, who are kind of just attendants there, and we'll talk about them in a bit more detail later on. There's the very wild Linda, who I think almost has a sentence throughout the whole of the first series, and there's Angie, who is his secretary, who again hardly has anything to do in the series, but then something happens later on which we won't get into again because of spoilers and stuff. So I think that is the majority of the cast. Oh no, and also there's the receptionist, Carol, who again, someone else who looks like she's on the verge of a nervous breakdown, has found out her husband's cheating on her, and then has her has a newborn children living in the drawers of reception. So just to give you an idea of the tone that this series has. Have I missed anyone?
I don't think so. I think you've pretty much covered the regulars pretty succinctly there, yeah.
Yeah, so the general idea is that Brittas is supposed to be like well-meaning, but then he's a stickler for all the rules. He's like he seems to be like really into bureaucracy and like wanting to be a leader and stuff. But people just find him really annoying, and because he's too into it, and he can't read social cues almost. Social cues, and kind of has a strange idea of himself that's not fully true. And the comedy comes from how he interacts with all these people who are bouncing off him and all that, and hilarity that ensues afterwards. As we think, because we're not going to go through episode by episode, we are talking about the series this first series in general. What were your initial thoughts after? I'm assuming this was not the first time you watched it, or?
It's hard to say, because it's been so long since I've watched it. I really enjoyed it when I was young, back in the 90s as a teenager, but I won't have watched it since then, and I can't remember particularly specific episodes, probably in the same way you do. I remember the tone of it, I remember characters, and so there were familiar aspects to it straight away. But I don't know if I have seen this season before, actually. It's quite possible I haven't, because my memories of the show are definitely further down the line. There's one or two characters who aren't in this season that I remember, and I was a bit like, where's that character? Like, they're not in this yet. So it's funny. I think, well, actually, it's not particularly. That's right. So this is the thing. I didn't find it very funny. I found it I laughed. I chuckled a few times, maybe half a dozen times throughout the entire 6 episodes. And I think it's not that I didn't like it, because I do like the show, but it is very classically in that mould of the British sitcom, particularly around this time. And you see that this in everything from Only Fools and Horses to One Foot in the Grave, all like classic sitcoms, but they have quite ropey first seasons. And it takes a couple of years for them to get on their feet and start really showing what they can do. And I definitely felt that way about this.
Definitely, because one of the big things that I took from it was that I think a lot of it was informed by how much I remember the characters, actually. So it was quite nice seeing them kind of work them out. So, and I found myself having some really quite big belly laughs at some places. And I think that's because I had some familiarity with the characters in general. I was then struggling to try and then after a bit I tried to step back and think about it a bit more logically, and bits I found I quite laughed at because some of the jokes I found hit quite well and tickled my funny bone. But in terms of structure and how the characters and the premise is formed, I think there are actually a lot of rough ideas they haven't quite nailed properly yet. And there are shades in which the roles of what the characters should be in regards to how they revolve around Brittas, and they only start showing up in like the last episode of stuff, in the last episode of the series. Now, for example, Julia St. John plays Laura. Now, Julia St. John is the only other actress aside from Chris Barrie who is billed on the actual DVDs, and so Laura's given like this like key role, and from what I remember, she's supposed to be the straight character to Gordon Brittas, and I don't think the series gets her correct until she has this quite good scene at the very end of the series, in the end of the first series, where Brittas is in a hospital bed, where she says that she believes that he's actually kind-hearted and has the right intentions, but the complete opposite approach to executing those intentions. But then doesn't get the chance to kind of bounce off her straight man characteristics against his buffoonery or his comic sensibilities, so to speak, and that should really have been kind of established in the first episode, whereas like throughout the series you get bits where it doesn't really click on how I remember the character. There's a bit in the second episode where I think through a series of errors or a series of situations, Brittas ends up inadvertently causing the electrocution of one of Laura's friends or romantic interests or whatever, and there's a bit where she gets kind of really hostile towards him, and I can't remember her ever being like that anywhere else. So you can kind of see that they don't fully figured out how the characters or the cast work around him yet.
I feel like they know the basic archetypes, because one of the things that's been pointed out is that Brittas is very much in the mould of that traditional sitcom character, described as an incompetent in charge of others. So you're talking about people like Captain Mainwaring from Dad's Army, Captain Peacock from Are You Being Served? They're these kind of imperious... It's interesting because they're all these kind of imperious colonial characters who are just buffoons, but they actually think that they're very serious, and they take everything very seriously, and they're very intense, and they're just idiots, and they keep getting shown up for who they are. Brittas is along similar lines. He's not necessarily as hard in some ways as they are, or as colonial, but there is that level of, Brittas. Well, for him, it's that he's an absolute sort of ultra Jobsworth kind of technocrat in what he does.
Yeah.
But then Laura is very much if you're using the Dad's Army comparison, she's the Wilson. She's John the Measurer in that, but very early on in Dad's Army, you understood the dynamic between Mainwaring and Wilson. Wilson was the deadpan sort of, guy opposite him. Whereas it's not quite been figured out yet with Laura, you're right. And I really think it's one of those examples. And again, you see this in all the different shows that I mentioned before and lots more. Usually they have the basics on paper, but it takes the actors to really gel with the characters, and then they write into those characteristics. And I think they wrote into Julia St. John. And I think the only two characters I think that are fully there, by and large, is Brittas. No, tell a lie, 3. I think there's 3 characters who are pretty much fully there. Brittas, Carol, and Colin. I think those 3, you can see, they're not really much different throughout the whole series, to be honest. Everyone else is sort of being figured out, and you see aspects of them. But then really, Brittas, Carol, and Colin are probably the 3 key comedy characters in the whole show. I mean, you could argue that Helen is, but they haven't quite got her yet, because eventually Pippa Haywood goes fucking off a rocker, as the show goes on, and she becomes increasingly neurotic and bonkers. And she's brilliant at that. I mean, you saw her do that fantastically then in Green Wing, where she kind of just took a lot of that character and just did it again in that show. But they need to write into the actors, and I think that's something that definitely happens. And I don't know if it happens in season 2. We'll find out, if it happens fairly quickly, but it's definitely not quite there yet with this.
Yeah, I can tell. I can see that, and I think again, I don't think the roles of how the characters that interact with Brittas were solidified across the whole of the ensemble. Because I was trying to figure out Colin's role, and I think Colin is possibly representative of the type of character that would actually get on Brittas's nerves, and because I think Brittas is someone who sees himself as getting on with everyone, but I think there's supposed to be someone in the cast who tests that, but it happens to be the one character who's absolutely devoted to him in terms of who actually would treat him with the respect that he wants to be seen by everyone else.
He's Pike. Colin's Pike. If you go back to Dad's Army again, it's that whole, he wants to please me. Oh, Mr. Brittas, he wants to please you all the time. And he's like, oh, Colin. Yeah.
But I think it's quite interesting that, I think it's not... It's like 95% there, where like the one character who will actually treat him with respect that Brittas wants the respect of, if that makes sense. Is the type of character that would actually push Brittas's buttons, and that's and I quite like the dynamic between them for that, in terms of like, well, you do have one member of staff that doesn't treat you like an idiot, but you don't treat him with respect. So it's but Colin's one of the characters that's always stuck in my head as well. So he's visually stands out. He's got I can't remember if it's this series or not, but he has like a yellow cardigan which makes him stand out towards the turquoise of. I think there's a turquoise blazer of. That's not turquoise. They put like a dark blue blazer that Brittas wears. You have the kind of dark blue like hoodie that Laura always constantly wears. Then you have the very aqua colour blending of the rest of the staff. So Colin does have like a kind of unique visual look to him, but he always looks kind of dirty anyway, and he visually stands out. Yeah. He's meant to be a bit of a grotesque, really, but he's that. He's very like with most sitcoms, there's absolutely some class stuff going on here. He's northeastern, right? And he's the shabby northerner, who's just a little bit dim-witted, ostensibly, and a bit weird and a bit dirty. And everyone else is very sort of middle class and southern, aren't they? Yeah. And it for me that's definitely. I don't know if that would quite be written in the same way anymore. There is for me, there's absolutely a bit of a class divide thing going on there. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I don't think the class divide is as big in this series as it would be for other series.
No, definitely. Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure that the class divide is something that I'm pretty sure you've written about in the past, or at least has made reference to
somewhere. Or the north-south divide, at least. That the difference between those two sort of British subcultures in a way. And it's because it's very much that kind of. the Brittas Empire is very much that Southern British BBC sitcom style of comedy. You know,
Yes.
It's not really. It doesn't ever feel like it's placed anywhere in particular. It doesn't have a particularly definitive location like you would get with, say, Only Fools and Horses, which is very London, you know, or you would get with Rab C. Nesbitt, which is very Scottish, you know, or whatever. It doesn't really have that place, that sense of place necessarily.
Yeah.
So and that's probably intentional.
Yeah, I think the closest geographic location we get, I think, and I can't remember if it was actually on screen or whether it's referenced in a future series. So forgive me if is that I think he recently trained at Aldershot, which I believe is within Hampshire. So
Kent.
Aldershot is in a town in the Rushmore district of Hampshire. So it is on.
Ah, okay.
So
right. I stand corrected. I always thought it was, but yeah, again, I mean, no offense to anyone in Hampshire, but like, does Aldershot really stand out like to anyone? Is it one of those places where you go, oh, you're from Aldershot? No, you just don't. Just not, is it? It's not one of those kind of places. Sorry for all the Aldershot listeners. I've just said your town is boring, but you know, prove me wrong. Come at me.
But yeah. So going through the rest of the cast then, before we go back to talking about it in general, Tim and Gavin is one of the elements that I think when I first watched it, I never fully clocked on of what it was until I was much older when rewatching it, and rewatching the first series, I thought that it was a lot more subtle than it actually is. But considering this was 1991, the characters of Gavin and Tim are actually a couple, so they're two men in a relationship, and it's not explicitly said that they're gay, but I do think that for the purpose of representation, I think it is revealed that Tim is bisexual in a future series. So, and the reason I mention that now is that you have a bisexual character and a gay character in a BBC One primetime sitcom in January 1991. And neither of them are a caricature that you would get. So you don't have James Dreyfus in Gimme Gimme Gimme. It's not John Inman. It's not your stereotypical gay character that you would expect, that you would be seeing at this time. I mean, 10 years down the line, you would have in Coupling. There's an episode where I think Jane tries to seduce a gay man, and again he dips into your stereotypical camp effeminate gay character archetype that you have. Here you have two characters that don't dip into that, and which for me I think is quite amazing in the 90s.
Well, I mean, I in a way, I hesitate to be too authoritative on this because I'm not a gay man. You're not a gay man, and we don't know how this would be approached by the LGBTQ community, particularly now. But I would say, from the outside perspective, that there's two ways to look at it. I think the one way to look at it is, are they really being written as gay characters, or is it that very sort of old school, we're two men and we live together, you know, kind of thing, in that there's not really, there's a suggestion of homosexuality, but it's all very, you know, like two male friends, a bit Cliff Richardy, you know, that whole thing, the whole Bachelor Boy thing. Or is it actually quite good in the idea that it doesn't make them stereotypes, as you say, it doesn't make them caricatures, and it doesn't even necessarily massively draw attention to it all the time, which is great. You know, ultimately that's surely where we want to get to with fiction, with storytelling, and with representation, that it's not a something to stick out as an other, you know, as something abnormal. So I suppose I'm sort of caught between the two, because I'm not entirely convinced that the BBC in the 90s were that progressive. But at the same time,
I mean, at
the same time, it's better than you would have had
for
most of the time.
I mean, that in terms of a base level, I was quite surprised at how it was represented. However, later in the series, they do kind of verge into more stereotypes, and again, as two straight men being obviously the authority, I decided, you know what, I'll go and speak to Mark. I asked Mark to watch the first series, So Mark Adams, one of your regular hosts, and out gay man for several decades now. I asked him for his opinions because, again, he said we're not the authority, so I would rather get his opinion on how Gavin and Tim relationship was developed. And I'll read out what he sent me. So, okay, some thoughts on Tim and Gavin. The show must be championed for the first ever sympathetic, openly gay couple on a British sitcom. As a kid, I didn't spot that they were a couple like you didn't, but it's hardly subtle. But it then goes on, I was disappointed that the stereotype of gay men cheating or promiscuity appeared so early in episode 2. I feel that Brittas' obliviousness is actually pretty accurate and indicative of the time. It's not that he's homophobic, it's that he's completely aware of the situation through his own inexperience and encountering of any gay people. But he only watched the first 3 episodes. So, and because there's a bit in episode 6 which I kind of want to talk about because it kind of damages Brittas' premise as a character in a way, and it's manipulative to get to the plot. But we'll talk about that in a second. So Brittas has a conversation with Gavin about Tim, and he raises suspicions that Tim is a bit. And kind of does that kind of cringeworthy kind of like eyebrow raise, and then basically suggests that he'll be hanging around the changing rooms in the showers and perving, which not really a good look for a British sitcom, if I'm honest, or a character. And to quote Mark, it made my skin crawl, but I've seen worse homophobia in Only Fools and Horses.
Yeah, oh God, yeah. I mean, that is a whole other conversation, and it's something we might get into on my other show.
Yeah.
But Only Fools is really homophobic now. I mean, when you look back at it, and it's got actual slurs in, proper slurs, and watching that back now really makes you wince. If you're the kind of person who finds this problematic, i.e., not a twat, then. Then yeah, it does, and so yeah, this, and I'm glad. It's great to hear from Mark there because his opinion is absolutely, I would say, much more valid in many ways than ours on this, and it's great to hear that because I think it must be very interesting as a gay person to watch something like this, which. I'd love to speak to the writers about it, to be honest, and find out more because I'd love to know what their perspective was in what they were trying to do, whether this was intentional, whether it was accidental, whether it was just they were really trying to push the envelope in the limited way they could at a time when you just didn't see this.
Yeah.
Like it just didn't exist in the BBC's, field of vision. In these kind of ways. But
Russell Porter, who plays Tim, is a gay man himself, and there's an article I think on thegayuk.com where he speaks to them and he says that he believes that him and Gavin will be together 20 years down the line, and he says that at the time, I didn't get the sense of how important it would be. As a gay man myself, I wanted to, as much as you can in Fast, to be fair to the characters. It wasn't the gay thing that was the issue. It was the not understanding the gay issue, and that's the gag. When auditioning for the part, I said, don't ask me to be any more gay or camp than I am already. I am not going down that route. So I mean, I say I never realised that Russell Porter himself was gay and stuff, and it's quite interesting to hear him talk about how he was approaching that and stuff, and particularly gay in early 90s. But no, I completely agree. It'll be interesting to see what the creative decisions were with that. And again, I wonder whether that's a case of writing to the actors, as you said earlier. So perhaps with Porter there saying that he didn't want to be the stereotype or act the stereotype, so he was pretty much being himself.
Yeah, maybe, which is great. I'm going to be curious to see how it develops as the seasons go on, actually, and if there is any change in that relationship.
Yeah, definitely. Other characters that we have Carol, the receptionist, now played by Harriet Thorpe.
Harriet Thorpe is awesome. She is such a great comic actor. Like she's not massively in loads and loads of things, but I used to love it when she'd pop up in Absolutely Fabulous because she was really funny in that as well. It's like, she is so good. Like, Carol is the character for me that just stands out, really. She's probably my favourite character in this, because it's just the way she's played is so good.
There's the I think there's an episode like halfway through the episode, one of the better episodes of the series, of this series actually. I think it's the third episode with the anger management seminar, where pretty much Brittas manages to get the anger management speaker to have like a massive rage tantrum. But there's a bit where her husband comes back and wants to reconcile and says sorry, and there is just a massive physical change in how she shapeshifts her whole body language, her voice tone, and like it's like a different character. It's the only thing I can think of is there's a scene in Superman 2 where Christopher Reeve merges from, he's playing Clark Kent, it takes his and when Lois Lane's not looking, kind of shifts normal, and he kind of like grows a foot. And his voice gets confident, and it feels like a different person has just morphed into the room, and that's what she does in that half an episode. Yeah. But Mark did also mention Carol, and as he mentions the 80s and the 90s ick with Red Dwarf, he does raise potential 90s ick with Carol in that he didn't find it very funny in terms that it was kind of mocking. Or not mocking, the comedy was coming from an antenatal depression, which I never thought it might have been at a point, and then looking at it, I was like, crap.
I don't know. I think it's an interesting point, and I think comedy is there to be unpicked, and you do see things differently with time and distance. And I think I wouldn't. It's not something that for me stood out, but then it probably wouldn't. You know, I think it maybe might not be on my radar. So I think it's an interesting one. It's an interesting one. It's probably not something many people have brought up because Brittas hasn't really had much in the way of critical reappraisal. So, you know, it would be interesting, particularly to see what a female perspective on Carol is actually, and that whole thing now.
Yeah, that should be interesting to that. Particularly with how the character develops, because I think Carol's one of the more memorable characters. I think a lot of stuff that happens with her, I still have memories of what happens to her, whereas I think some of the characters, I don't. But I think there's the character of Linda, who is one of the main cast and has about a sentence an episode. So we don't. She's supposed
nothing there really, is there?
She's supposed to be the kind of enthusiastic, peppy, and I think is supposed to be someone who, I think from what I remember from later seasons, her role is supposed to be someone who is just kind of enthusiastic and doesn't hate Brittas but doesn't like him either, and is just there to do the job and likes doing the job, but you do not get any of that whatsoever.
No, I think maybe it's that she's underwritten.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the actor who is not necessarily the strongest. But yeah, she's okay, but she always fades into the background, really, doesn't she?
Yeah.
To be fair.
Yeah. And I think finally, we also will talk a bit more about the character of Helen, who is Brittas' wife. And I think she's supposed to be kind of like not unhinged, but she's unhappy. Possibly depressed, but and in a marriage that trapped in a marriage she doesn't like but doesn't want to be in, and thus has affairs with the code word is Uncle Simon, which and Brittas doesn't clock on whatsoever. And again, I think as you said before, Helen's a character who I think they kind of get a feel for Pippa Haywood as an actress, and she does okay here. I just don't think they don't get Helen complete yet.
I mean, for one thing, she every other word out of her mouth fails the Bechdel test. For one thing, all she ever does is talk about Gordon. Yeah. Every conversation she has is about Gordon, and in fact, she has quite a lot of conversations with a friend or with other people that actually explain him and his psyche to us. Yeah. She becomes a mechanism for that, actually, throughout this season.
Yeah.
She's a mechanism for explaining his backstory, how they met, what kind of person he is. And And she kind of, I felt that she's quite unsympathetic in a way here, because the idea is that she's supposed to be this tortured wife living with this, tyrannical Roman emperor in a leisure centre who is completely neglectful. But I didn't always get that, because then she's going off and sleeping with somebody else. And I was a bit like, well, he's not a horrible person. He's not a horrible bad guy. He's an idiot, and he's a pompous blowhard who is addicted to his work.
Yeah.
But I didn't necessarily feel the sympathy. And I feel that maybe later on, as Brittas becomes a bit... And as he becomes more and more down that road, and he gets ever more sort of Brittas-y, and she gets ever more sort of neurotic and tragic, it works a bit better. That you actually feel that she's like trapped in this horrible situation. It gets more and more eccentric. But I didn't really get that here. And I just felt like she was just a little bit, sometimes a bit of a cow, actually, and how she was out sleeping with somebody else. She wasn't necessarily the victim that maybe they thought she was.
Yeah, really. There are times I think where Gordon, keep saying Gordon, where Brittas is. There are parts where Brittas is seen as being actually completely devoted to his wife. He just can't, and like he constantly talks her up, and there are like times where he does give her praise, he misreads stuff as praise. Or no, misreads stuff and kind of like gives her praise and stuff, and like says he's like, and like talks her up quite a lot. There's a great, I think it's episode 4 or 5, where they go to Helen's counsellor for marriage counselling, and and Brittas's role as perhaps one of the first examples of mansplaining is really applied here. He's the principal mansplainer, actually, when you think about it, but the unmalicious mansplainer.
Yeah.
Where he doesn't realise what he's doing. He's got no kind of self-awareness.
No.
Where so like whenever they mention the counsellor tries to speak to Helen, he answers for her and stuff, and you get some sympathy for her back. You get some sympathy there, but
in that,
But you do get that impression. You can kind of get that impression of how much he kind of misreads what he should be doing with his relationship and stuff. But
I think she's there. The sketch of the character's there, and what they're trying to do with that is there. The idea that she's married to this man, and she says it in one of the episodes that he wasn't always like this. When they were younger, and this happens so often when you get these. You'll introduce a sitcom scenario, and it's a marriage or a relationship, and it's at a particular stage where one of them. There's another good example of this, one that actually is quite similar, is The Thin Blue Line. Have you seen The Thin Blue Line with Rowan Atkinson?
Yes.
The relationship between his character, Raymond Fowler, in that, and his partner, I can't remember her name now, the character. But yeah, it's a very, very similar dynamic. He's oblivious, he's dedicated to his work. She wants passion, she wants romance, she wants him to love her, and he completely misses it all the time. And that's where the comedy comes from. It's slightly different in that show, but it's a similar idea, and you get it in a lot of shows, and I think it's a good comedy idea, and Brittas does. The show does get to that. It does much more with that, and it's much better as time goes on. But at the beginning, like a lot of the things in the show, it is an outline, and it's not fully shaded in. And again, I think it's the characters. I think the characters bring it out, and you see it in some of those scenes. You see it in the counselling scene, which is a good example of where you do feel a bit for Helen, because he is quite bullish and old school, and he is talking for his wife and all those kind of things. But yeah, I think it takes a while for them to get to that point where it fully clicks together.
Yeah, they also completely steal, or it's either a reference or they steal completely nearly word for word a joke from Red Dwarf. So
okay, well that's got to be done, isn't it? If it's Chris Barrie.
Right, I'm going to read to you the quote from Red Dwarf, and you'll get it. Keep that scene in mind. So, Rimmer, I used to be with the Samaritans. Lister, I know, for one morning. Well, I couldn't take it anymore. I don't blame you. You spoke to 5 people and they all committed suicide. I wouldn't mind, but one was the wrong number. You only phoned up for the cricket scores. Which exactly is very similar to the conversation that Helen has with the psychiatrist, where because he mentions he worked with Samaritans, and then when they're on their own, he goes, "You work for the Samaritans? Oh yeah, he only worked for one day." 5 Samaritans, like 5 people found of committing suicide, but only one of them was the wrong number. Yeah, it's the exact same joke. They used the exact same joke, and it can't be a coincidence. So yeah.
Can we just stop and talk a little bit about your attempted Craig Charles impression there?
Yes. my Scouse accent. I don't blame you.
There was a yeah. Okay, good. All right.
I don't blame you.
Fine.
You spoke to 5 people. There have been worse attempts at the Scouse accent on this podcast, not by me.
Yeah. No, yeah, sure, yeah, that's fine.
But yeah. Wine, drinking wine. Ben, I can
stop now.
Yeah.
I've unleashed Pandora's box. Stop.
It's okay. Kurt's going to hear that, and he's going to start just listening to this, muttering the word wine, drinking wine. Sorry, Kurt. In terms of things overall into Brittas as a character, and a bit more into him and stuff, is that, as you said, you can easily compare him to other British characters in sitcom history. There's, for example, if you compare him to Rimmer, which I know, a character that I know you're all familiar with, Tony, as you said earlier.
I've watched enough of it to know what the character's like. Don't worry, I've got a good idea. Yeah, don't worry.
Yeah, so there's a common thread in that they can both be self-serving, but I do think that Brittas has a lot more. Brittas has, if not selfless, a more positive and more noble idea of what that self-serving means. So I've always thought if a child went up to both characters and they said that they were their inspiration, I believe it would probably make both characters' days. However, I think Brittas would care about the well-being of that person that said to him, and whereas Rimmer would just think that Rimmer would just go, oh yeah, that was me, and just not bother, and then forget the person and forget the kid's name like a second later. Yeah. Whereas Brittas, I think would be like the people, like those teachers who keep saying, "Oh, please let me know how you're getting on," and would it be if it'd be 20 years, and then if they turned up, Brittas would remember everything that he remembers about that person that said that to him, whereas Rimmer would probably just forget it ever happened. So it's that kind, which I think is interesting when you compare them both of them as well. Whereas when you got the more noble character of Brittas, the more realistic character is Rimmer. Probably the more tragic character as well. So So
I think Brittas is he's an archetype dialed up for comic effect. You know, he's not a real person. I mean, and that's the thing. It's like, this is where I think Brittas Empire, and maybe it's one of the reasons why it hasn't necessarily stood the test of time in the same way as some of the other mainstays of comedy, in that I don't, and I might be proven wrong with this because it's been a while, but I don't really necessarily think he has that level of grounded sort of reality to him that you would see in a Del Boy or you would see in a Victor Meldrew, where even though they're often in heightened comedy scenarios, there is either a tragedy to them or there is a real genuine aspect. Yes, okay, there are people like Brittas. There are these imperious, you know, slightly pompous do-gooders who also just run staff in a really sort of self-oblivious way. And, you know, there is absolutely connective tissue between this and David Brent in The Office.
Yes,
because there really is, because you can definitely see the same kind of archetypes and things going on. There's probably even a bit of Alan Partridge in Brittas as well, you know, and Brittas in Alan Partridge, I should say, because Brittas came first. So there are definite sort of inspirations and things that I think people would have seen this kind of character, but he's not real. And I think that's the whole thing, in that the reason I don't think this season works as well is that they haven't yet figured out that fully, and there are moments of this, but they haven't yet figured out that because Brittas is hyper real, the show can be. And then later on, as it goes on, it becomes increasingly bonkers.
Yes.
And it can do it, you know, it can do it because it might as well be a parallel universe sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
And there are moments of it in this season, but they haven't quite figured that out yet.
Oh, there are. I don't want to spoil it for anyone if anyone's listening to this thinking, oh, okay, and perhaps want to watch a few more beyond this. Don't want to spoil it, but there's a specific development that always stay with me, and that is so bonkers. It's what I was alluding to before. It's so bonkers, and how they resolve it is frankly ridiculous. That it puts Brittas Empire on a whole nother level in terms of the reality of it. And as I was saying earlier, I mean, if you compare again, it reaches levels of like comic fantasy in places where
totally.
It's
absurdity.
Not, it's not completely absurdity, so it doesn't evolve into like Family Guy, or it doesn't evolve into like Family Guy style like absurdity. But there are kind of like moments in the comedy here that just are too absurd that Red Dwarf wouldn't touch. Red Dwarf, as much as it's a science fiction show, has elements, is kind of grounded in that you could theoretically think that with science, things in Red Dwarf could actually happen. Whereas there are loads of things that will happen in the Brittas Empire that would never happen. Where it's impossible, it would have happened. I'm hoping you know which thing I'm talking about, because it's a massive thing that happens.
I might have an idea, but don't spoil it, because I'm looking forward to rediscovering some of this a bit fresh myself. So I've got an idea.
It doesn't happen for a while yet, but yeah. So and I think one of the last things I want to talk about as well, you brought up, is that there are a lot of parallels to like David Brent, in terms of that. But again with The Office, because at the time of recording and probably the time of airing as well, you've just started on your own kind of like writing blog, going through the episodes of the UK Office and dissect and they're fascinating reads. I fully recommend listening to them, because they are pretty much devoted to the psychology behind David Brent, and it's quite interesting to read that comparing to the characters, because I think there's not really been a comic character and like David Brent, and it'll be very hard to find another one like him. And I think there are elements between the two of Brent and Brittas, but Brent is someone who 100% will exist. You will know someone exactly like Brent. Whereas you'll have traces, you'll have Brittas who go, oh yeah, he reminds us of so-and-so who at work and stuff. But like, there is a much more possibility you will find someone who is 100% David Brent rather than 10% Gordon Brittas.
Yeah, but I think the difference is, and there is, and you might have mentioned this earlier, but there is, going the other way, very clear connective tissue to Fawlty Towers and to Basil Fawlty with this. Yeah. But the difference is, I think, and this is where Brittas does its own thing in the end from both of these shows, in that The Office is much more about the observational reality of that show is all possible. There's nothing in The Office that is hyper real. Everything that happens in that show could happen, and probably has happened in offices around this country.
Yes. And
that's where the comedy comes from. Whereas in Fawlty Towers, again, it's a hyper real world. That it is such a contained pressure cooker environment that yes, that person did kind of exist because the Pythons met him and John Cleese turned him into that character. But really, you could never put Basil Fawlty in a different place. He exists purely in that. And in a way, Brittas is the same. Brittas exists in that leisure centre. It would be weird to put Brittas running a hotel or doing something, because he's very specific in that location. But what I think the Brittas Empire doesn't have yet, it doesn't have the pressure cooker environment to evoke Fawlty Towers' level of farce.
Yeah.
It tries in the first season to build to levels of farce, but it doesn't quite work.
It nearly, I think episode 2, it almost gets it right, because it has the boiler engineer, and I think because there's an issue with the pool, he starts to have like PTSD flashbacks, and thinks that he's on a ship and it's sinking because the boiler room.
Well, yeah, that's it. But he's portrayed very specifically like a salty dog seaman, like in the bowels of an engine room in a big ship, isn't he? That's the whole joke, is that he's portrayed like that. And again, he wouldn't exist in the real world. You wouldn't have that character in a boiler room in a leisure centre who looks like that. And that's the whole thing. Those are the moments in this season where I was like, that's what this show is. That's the point. That's what I want this show to really lean into, and it does, from what I remember as time goes on. Yeah. And it dials up the surrealism. I think that's the key. Fawlty Towers wasn't surrealist; it was farcical. The Office is observational and painful, whereas Brittas is surrealist. And I think once it realises that, and it realises what it can do, it takes off. Whereas right now it's sort of trapped in a bit of a cosy, laughter track paradigm where things get to a certain level. You get a lot of Chris Barrie, who is great. There's no getting away from that. He is spot on as Brittas pretty much from day one, doing a lot of the yes, Carol, but kind of thing. And that is up enough to a certain point, but you need everything else around it, and that's not quite there yet. So once they get to that, once they figure that out, it really takes off.
Yeah, and I can't wait to see, because I was really tempted to start watching series 2 after finish series 1, because I've got series 1 and 1 to 3 on DVD, and I managed to stop myself from advancing to watch series 2. So because I was getting into it. I mean, there are, like I said, there are issues with it. Bits that haven't dated as well as it should do. But I think because I kind of I had that kind of growing up attachment to it. I was there are bits that I found quite hilarious. I mean, I thought the third episode was bloody hilarious with the anger management, seminar. That
was probably that probably is the funniest. Yeah, I would say that's probably the funniest one of the 6. Yeah,
but I think, I think a lot of it is kind of to do with like how the characters work and stuff, and how things kind of disconnect and stuff. And I think before we leave, I think the only thing I was trying to briefly mention is that I think there's almost attempts at serialization in places. The first 2 are kind of like you couldn't watch episode 2 without watching episode 1 because they kind of still haven't opened by series episodes 2. So the whole plot of episode 2 is them opening. So like they kind of just building, they kind of like getting preparation for the opening in episode 1, and but it kind of falls a little bit by the assassin episode, which is the final episode of the series, where it looks like someone's trying to kill Brittas, and if they had the foresight, there's a couple of people, like particularly I think there's a couple of people in the first episode or like at least second or third, that theoretically could have been nice to have been the person tempted to kill him. But then the way the plot's structured, it turns out to be someone who you don't see until the reveal. You've never seen them before, and then there's this whole backstory about apparently that Brittas is part of a church choir, and that this guy who's trying to kill him and it just falls flat. This person knows. Yeah, it does. The person knows Gavin, and I think Gavin, and the plot kind of needs Gavin to kind of help Brittas get in the line of sight of this assassin, which is when the whole very uncomfortable conversation about Tim happens. But the payoff just doesn't work. It doesn't work, and there are bits throughout the first series of this where it's like, if a bit more foresight, the payoff could have been a lot better. But the plot just doesn't land properly.
No, and that's where I think the writing doesn't really hold up, to be honest, and I think that definitely seems to improve as time goes on. But the writing isn't quite sharp enough yet in order for what is a talented cast to really make the most of it. And I think the writing does sharpen up for sure as time goes on.
Yeah, and that as time goes on, I'm actually still looking forward to watching the rest. And I think that's a good point to kind of end our conversation about the first series of the Brittas Empire. And I hope that you've enjoyed the conversation that we've had, and I hope people listening, and I don't really care if you like it, Tony. So you only hear it.
That's it. I'm only the guest.
Yeah, you're only the guest.
Don't treat me with any respect.
Yeah,
that's fine.
You hardly watched Red Dwarf. I'm surprised we let you on. But now
that's true. Yeah.
But now, I want to say thank you ever so much for coming on, Tony, and it's been great chatting with you, and ever so looking forward to listening to You Have Been Watching, because that sounds great. But before we sign off, I'm sure as well there are other podcasts that you're involved in. Why don't you tell people where you can find them and where they can find you online?
Well, the best place to find me is mainly on Twitter, is where I hang about a lot. So check me out on Twitter at AJ Black Writer. You'll find links to various things. The blog you mentioned, where I'm doing reviews of The Office and various other things, is called The Truth Is Out. The Truth Is In Here, not The Truth Is Out There. That's because it's a play on that. The Truth Is In Here.co.uk, which is my blog space where I'm doing write-ups of The Office, the UK Office. So you might enjoy those. And I'm on lots of different podcasts at various points. You can find You Have Been Watching Soon on We Made This, the podcast network Shipwrecked and Comatose is part of. Find us at WNT_network on Twitter and WeMadeThisNetwork.com for all the other kind of things I'm on. So yeah, that's me. Yeah,
you can find me under Pick a Disc, because that's the podcast that I host when I'm not disrupting the flow of Shipwrecked and Comatose. So you can find us anywhere on your favourite podcast app of choice, or Facebook, Twitter and Instagram under Pick a Disc. So yeah, you can follow me on that there. Also, but if you want to, you can always get in contact with the Shipwrecked and Comatose Twitter account, which is at Red Dwarf Pod. I hope, because I just suddenly lost the page it had that information on. So I'm sure I'll be hearing from Mark and Kurt very shortly saying you've got the Twitter name wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's Red Dwarf Pod because we managed to nab it. And you can find us on podcast apps of choice as well. So I do hope that you've enjoyed either revisiting or discovering the Brittas Empire. If you used to watch it, please let us know how right we are or how wrong we are, or your own opinions on this as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you've never watched it before and then decided to watch this because of what we've been talking about, please let us know how you found it. I'll be generally intrigued to hear any new thoughts of people watching it for the first time. So yeah, feel free to get in contact. And I think with that, it's time for us to sign out. So I want to say goodbye, Tony.
Goodbye, Tony.
Thank you. And that's all that's left to say is excellent.
Shipwrecked and Comatose, a Red Dwarf podcast, was created and produced by Mark Adams and Kurt North. You can find us on Twitter at Red Dwarf Pod, and we are part of the We Made This podcast network, which can be found online at wemadethispod.com or on Twitter at wemadethispod.
Hello everyone, this is Tony, Network Chief of We Made This. As you know, our podcast network brings together a brilliant assortment of talent who talk about all kinds of pop culture content, such as the episode you just listened to, or maybe you're just about to listen to. We're not going anywhere, but we'd love to keep the lights on for even longer if you're able to support our network on Patreon. For just £2 a month, you get your name in lights and the satisfaction of knowing you're helping us produce more great audio. And for £3 a month, you'll get your name in lights, but you'll also get access to an exclusive bi-monthly podcast from the We Made This talent pool on podcasting, pop culture, and, well, you tell us. We'll take your suggestions. For less than the price of a coffee per month, you can help keep We Made This going. Just head to patreon.com/We Made This. That's patreon.com/We Made This. And get the ball rolling. Now, back to your scheduled programming. Elsewhere on We Made This. Back to the decade.
And then, like you said, Dom Toretto responds with, "Your mistake is thinking you're in the United States. This is Brazil." And then everyone points their guns at him.
Great plan.
Quite a scene.
I love all the guys with armor and tanks are like, "Hey man, Swiss versus the Rock. This is a lot of heat. We should get out of here." Fuck.
Get out of here, man.
Oh man.
Cerebral Jukebox.
I think as I've got older, I don't care what people think of my music taste anymore. I'm happy to admit that, like, I really missed the boat because, like, in the 2000s, I was moody, angsty teen, and I was listening to Papa Roach and Linkin Park on the daily. And I'd be ashamed to admit that I kind of like Savage Garden and Craig David, and I had this very strange diet. But now I go back and listen to all these, like, 2000s UK garage tracks, and they were absolutely astounding.
Life's milestones.
So when I met my wife, we couldn't decide who should go first for having kids. We knew we both wanted to. And so we kind of were up for playing a bit of Russian roulette.
Okay.
We also, in Canada, we get a year of maternity leave when a baby is born. And so we wanted to each have a baby so that we could have a year together with our whole family and just like get to know each other. And so we opted for that, and we found a known donor that was willing to provide us with some sperm, and we both got pregnant around the same time, and our babies were born 25 days apart.
With the same donor?
Same donor, yeah.
Does that make them twins?
We call them twiblings, twin siblings.
Brilliant. Brilliant. I love this.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network.